All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 5th, 1969, a group of women in Boston are preparing to meet at what was dubbed a Female Liberation Conference at Emmanuel College. In a workshop called Women and Their Bodies, they shared experiences with doctors and their frustration at how little they knew about how their bodies worked. That kind of direct information sharing was incredibly powerful, and what came out of it, built on those frustrations and that need for sharing information, was even more powerful. It was a pamphlet, a booklet, 136 pages stapled together, a product of the newly formed Boston Women's Health Book Collective. That self-published booklet was called Women and Their Bodies, and a couple years later, it would be renamed Our Bodies, Our Selves. This would go on to sell millions of copies, be wildly influential and helpful to women generation after generation. As one of the original organizers put it, we didn't have the information we needed, so we decided to find it and share it on our own. So, here to discuss the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, the influence of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and lots more are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
So, look, if we're talking about a pamphlet and then a book that is written in reaction to a lack of something, let's talk about that lack. Let's paint a scene of what at this time constitutes information, doctor's advice, doctor's counsel when it comes to women's health.
I mean, we have talked about this before with our episode on George Wallace and his wife, Lorleen. The fact that it was withheld from her that she had ovarian cancer. And the fact that you could give women's husbands a diagnosis and then keep that diagnosis from them. You know, it's something that we're all appalled by, but this was common practice. Doctors did not always share information with their female patients. And even when women tried to have questions about their body, even that was sort of questioned. The practice was you can't possibly be an expert on your own body.
Yeah, there had been restrictions on women's knowledge of their own bodies, not just on things like contraception, but their actual knowledge of their own bodies for decades, right? Ever since the late 19th century, there were obscenity bans on pamphlets that explained to women how reproduction worked, that explained sex and sexuality. And so the very basic things of reproduction, of pregnancy, of postpartum depression, these were things that medical doctors didn't talk to women about. They sometimes talk to their husbands, but not to the women themselves. Yeah. And so women are gathering in the late 1960s as the women's liberation movement is emerging, and they have these consciousness raising groups where they sit around and they talk about things. And one of the things that some women in Boston are talking about in 1969 is, why don't our doctors, A, tell us anything, and B, why don't they actually know anything? So it wasn't just like a limit on what women knew, it was a limit on what doctors knew.
Well, and that I think is so important that, you know, there's kind of two parts to this dynamic, which is one, this paternalistic attitude like we're describing, like, well, you know, the husband makes the decision and women are not empowered to make decisions about their own bodies. But then there's a kind of like just pure lack of information or misinformation, and just sort of couldn't be bothered to even learn about this information, not just like don't even have the information to withhold or be paternalistic about. And, we did an episode about smoking bans a while ago. And our guest, that was such a good episode, but our guest in that mentioned offhandedly that there was a moment where, a doctor testified that maybe women want smaller babies. So smoking isn't bad for them or whatever.
I remember that.
And when I did 30 for 30, we did a series about a fight, and it was in this exact same moment, 1969, 1970, to have women run in the New York City Marathon. And there's a couple women who spoke in there about when they would go to the doctor's office, they would sit across from a doctor and be like, I'm a runner, I want to run a marathon, I want to run 26.2 miles. And doctors would literally tell them, if you run that much, your uterus will fall out.
Yep.
And you will not be able to have baby.
Oh my God!
And so it's not just like paternalism, it's literally just BS information.
Your uterus will fall out.
Literally, a doctor sat across from one of the people we interviewed and told her that.
Oh my
I want to know how many doctors saw women whose uterus fell out. And then we're like, oh my goodness, we really need.
Yeah. And I mean,
that's the absurdity of it is that there's never like the one person that they can point to or whatever. It's a lot of it is just arbitrary. Even my doctor told me that like 35 is the age of like, women's maternal health. When you want to have children, you're considered high risk after 35. And I was like, well, why 35? And they're like, I don't know. The number's kind of arbitrary. It's like, well, is it 30 or 40? Like, but that, there's still not enough attention paid to women's physical health and diseases that have real impacts on them, like endometriosis or, like ovarian cancer or things that directly impact women, it's really frustrating.
Mm-hmm. And a lack of studies even on things like heart attacks, where women often present differently than men when it comes to heart health and heart attacks. And there weren't studies that showed how women experience heart attacks. And so the whole range of women's health was something that the scientific medical community seemed somewhat incurious about for many, many years.
And so to bring it back to the project of this pamphlet and then this book, at a simple level, it's just a testament to, again, the power of just like, you're not alone, and if you go into your doctor with something and your doctor's not going to tell you, well, this is what you're going through is not uncommon and we know what it is and here's some way to treat it, where else are you going to get that simple message of just, you're not alone. What you're going through is not unique and there are other women who are experiencing this. And so at some basic level, this is a sort of solidarity and information sharing project, in addition to kind of like trying to empower women to really just take ownership and understand their own bodies.
It's no surprise that the book takes off. I mean, they sell 250,000 copies in New England without doing any advertising. The book sells like crazy. And I think this just shows the need and the desire that women have to understand their bodies. And also it sort of removes the stigma a little bit that like you can ask these questions. And if you feel ashamed about asking someone, you can go to this book and maybe you might find that answer that you're looking for in the book.
Yeah. And the idea that this like stapled together booklet sells so many copies, then they sort of publish it officially as a little book in 1971. It again sells another 250,000 copies. And then Simon & Schuster picks it up and publishes it as a book, like an official book. And it sells millions of copies because there is this real hunger for information about things that people often didn't talk about. I mean, this is something that's with us today, right? Like there's been a real push in recent years to talk about miscarriages as something that people just don't talk about. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about the shame and the disconnection that comes with not being able to talk about something, but you're cut off from necessary medical information, from the knowledge that this is something normal that happens to many, many, many women. And so it creates this body of knowledge that people are desperate for. And I think that it's important, too, that it is, as Jody was kind of pointing to, this is part of a political project. It gets renamed in 1971, Our Bodies, Our Selves. And that was a political statement about ownership of your person, about liberation, that you cannot truly be free as a person if you don't even have basic knowledge of your body and how it works. Like that there's something empowering about that.
Well, to that end, the original writers of the book kind of laid out 4 reasons for creating it. And I would say 2 of them are like health related, right? We need to just understand the way that our bodies work. But then 2 of them are a little bit more into what you're getting at, Nikki. They say that in this book will leave women, quote, better prepared to evaluate the institutions that are supposed to meet our needs. And then moreover, that I'm quoting here again, our bodies are the physical basis from which we move out into the world. And without this basic information, women are alienated from their own body and then necessarily on unequal footing with men. So there is a larger political project going on here. That said, I'm maybe a little surprised that there isn't like a huge backlash to this book or so. Like there's something about the way that this book is framed that actually doesn't feel threatening maybe in the way that I would expect. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see any stories of this book getting banned, or I don't see the stories of like of a moral panic around this book or some of the other things that frankly would happen today.
I think there's a review in the New York Times in 1973 that I think sort of encapsulates why this book resonated with so many people and perhaps why there wasn't a backlash. And the reviewer says, I don't see how any sensible woman, even an anti-feminist one, could fail to be enlightened by the book's lucidly informative chapters on the anatomy and physiology of reproduction and sexuality, and then also on nutrition, exercise, venereal disease, childbearing, postpartum emotional problems, or the philosophy that informs them. I mean, like, there's so much that goes into this book. It hits every different aspect. It's not just about abortion, or it's not just about puberty or menopause. I think because there is a totality or inclusiveness to it that covers so much about women's health, you're not going to get a whole lot of pushback talking about the benefits of exercise or what happens when you get your menstrual cycle. I think people appreciate that.
And it speaks to that particular moment in time, too. Up until the 1960s, it was still possible to outlaw birth control. That changes in 1965 with Griswold v. Connecticut. As late as 1968, the majority of Americans are opposed to premarital sex. By 1972-73, that number has flipped. The majority of Americans are fine with it. And so you start to have this sea change in attitudes around sex, around birth control, and even abortion, which will become an extremely polarizing issue later in the 1970s and the 1980s. And 1973 is not polarizing in the same way that we think about it today. And so I think that the moment that it hits in the early 1970s is one of those moments when it is almost less likely to engender a backlash because of how the oppositional politics are not quite organized in that moment.
I also think we shouldn't assume that just women are reading these books. I'm sure that men are reading them too, like, okay, what's happening here?
No. Well, funnily enough, I'll tell you, I know one man who read this book, the person who reviewed it for the New York Times, which I don't think would happen today, but the reviewer for the New York Times was Christopher Lehman Haupt. Of course, a man reviews it. That tells you something about 1973. But yeah, I think all that is a really good point. Okay, let's cut to now. I mean, as we've said, 70s, 80s, this book is wildly popular in I would say for basically every generation of women since then. Though in recent years, the kind of fate of this book has been a little dicier. Mostly, I'd say it's not a feminist story. It's more a book publishing and media environment story.
Yeah, so in 2018, the group that has been publishing this book, this feminist group based out of Boston, says that it's not going to publish new print editions. It had been publishing new editions every 4 or 7 years, and they weren't going to keep updating the website because they just didn't have the money to do it. Now, that said, they go into partnership with Suffolk University's Center for Women's Health and Human Rights in 2018, and they're developing a platform that will be able to update women with this same kind of information. Now, this sort of information is so much more widely available today. Mm-hmm. That it's not the same political project that it was in the 1970s, but it's astounding that this book has been in publication for now almost 50 years, and that it has been a resource to millions and millions and millions of women, not just in the U.S. but around the world, because it's been translated into 31 languages and Braille, what it's worth.
And you still, I would make the argument that you still need books like this because, with the internet, people are like, oh, I have back pain. Let me Google that, and you're like, wait, no, you don't have cancer.
Right.
You have to keep people also from going down rabbit holes of inaccuracy in terms of their bodies and health. I think we saw that a lot with the pandemic too. So having a reputable book that will sort of put a consensus of all of this in one space and place, I think is a really good thing to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, though that's a tough fight these days, in the days of TikTok and Goop and so forth, yeah, for sure. All right.
True.
Well, we will leave it there. This is super fascinating. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From